It's great to be with you. I'm Avik Roy. I'm the senior advisor to the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and I run a think tank here in town and in Austin, Texas, that works on a broad range of issues, not just Bitcoin, on how free enterprise and technological innovation can improve the lives of Americans on the bottom half of the ladder. And we have a great panel. Of course, we got a head start thanks to our colleagues in the last panel. So if I could take the liberty of summarizing what we heard earlier, we heard that the reason why Bitcoin mining exists is because you need to create an economic reward to secure the database, the ledger that records all the transactions. You don't have a bank or a government to do it for you, so if you want to do it in a decentralized way without some centralized institution doing it for you, you got to pay people to do it. And mining is the reward for paying people to do that. We also heard about alternatives to mining or to proof of work, the proof of work consensus mechanism. We heard about Ethereum moving to proof of stake as an alternative model. And so maybe the place to start here, and I'm going to start with you, Troy, because you're the philosopher in the room or on the panel. What is the purpose of consuming energy to prove that a transaction has happened, as opposed to some of these other mechanisms? We heard from, I think it was Brad, said, like, well, it's not as inclusive to have proof of stake because, one person can control a lot of the coins or the tokens and therefore have more voting shares with Ethereum or something like that. But, if I'm Chris Larson, one of the founders of Ripple, and I'm a believer in the earth, and I believe that consuming energy is really bad for the world. I mean, is it really important? I mean, isn't inequality in things like that not as important as saving the planet? I mean, what does it matter if there's a little more inequality, but at least the Earth's still around, right? So I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say I think the Earth is more important than the inequality question that was brought up earlier.
Wow, that's too much to answer in a short spiel. I'll say, I think the fundamental point of the consensus mechanism that we have is to determine the ordering of transactions without appeal to a social authority or any social mechanism at all. You can just look at two potential ledgers and determine which one is authoritative by seeing how much work was expended to create it. And you can figure that out just by looking at numbers, really. That's the magic of the technology, is just by looking at numbers you can determine from two potential records which one spent the most work. So it's a completely inhuman way of ordering transactions. And that's important because humans violate trust, and this allows us a trustless way to do it. Now, to your other question, is it worth it? This is a deep and difficult question. Well, how much do we need a trustless ledger? How much do we need a immutable, trustless record of transactions, or whatever you put on the Bitcoin blockchain, an immutable record of truth, something that can't be memory hold in the way that you get in 1984 in the Ministry of Truth? And that's a deep philosophical question. But I will say, I just give you background on myself. I started mining Bitcoin in 2011 in my own basement. And when I thought of this question, the question that you just asked, it was an obvious answer that no, it wasn't worth it, actually, or I didn't want to be a part of it. I liked the vision of Bitcoin, but I am an environmentalist, and I saw the potential for Bitcoin using tremendous amounts of energy and creating a lot of emissions, and decided to give my miners away. I've since come to a different view. That's why I'm sitting on this panel. It turns out that Bitcoin is really unique as a user of energy, as a consumer of energy. It's like nothing that has ever existed on this planet. It has a fixed schedule of issuance, unlike anything in nature. It's the most competitive market I think we've ever seen, the closest thing we've ever seen to a perfect market. Every miner converts energy to Bitcoin at basically the same rate because they're running the same machines. Their location does not matter as long as they are connected to the internet. So, and they're going after this perfectly fixed reward. Sort of their reward is their percentage of the entire Bitcoin network, going after 6.25 Bitcoins every 10 minutes. This creates a drive in the industry to find the cheapest energy. Energy is the biggest input, and it's a perfect market with a fungible good. So it's mining is going to be driven to really cheap energy. Ultimately, basically free energy is where the industry is headed. And so the question isn't, do we sacrifice the environment for the sake of this ledger? It's, what does an energy consumer that consumes only nearly free energy look like? What does that do to energy systems around the world? And what does that do for environmental impact? What kind of environmental impact does that have? We are headed in that direction. We're not fully there, but we see break-even prices for miners just decreasing and decreasing over time. And it was seeing that big picture, where mining is headed as an industry, inevitably, by its nature, to consume only extremely cheap energy, that led me to think, this could actually be a positive for the environment. It could actually be a positive for energy systems, because consuming cheap energy could actually help us to finance the transition to renewable energy. It can help us handle waste, methane, and so on.
Kerri, you run a mining company, Terawulf. Tell us a little bit about that, and tell us from a standpoint of a practitioner, how do the economics of mining work? I mean, what is it when you think about the input of energy and how you use energy? Explain to the audience that isn't familiar with Bitcoin mining how this all works. How does the economics of mining work when you're trying to consume energy?
Sure. Thank you. I'm going to sort of leverage some of the comments that Troy just made. As a Bitcoin miner, you know, it's almost like the oil industry. You're basically focused on being the lowest marginal cost producer.
The oil industry, that's bad for the earth.
And so you're focused on being the lowest marginal cost producer. And you know, there's misconceptions out there that no matter how much Bitcoin you're mining or where you're mining Bitcoin, you're going to increase the energy cost for everybody. And the reality is that's not true. The biggest component of energy cost is utilization. And so you need to step back a little bit and think about how the grid was designed, right? Originally, the grid was designed where you had supply follow demand. So you had big cities, whether it be New York City or LA, and you'd have gas peakers located right outside the city that could be ramped up or ramped down in a matter of 5 or 10 minutes. That's been completely flipped on its head with the drive to zero carbon and the influx of renewable resources. The biggest renewable resources are located in remote areas where the power is typically stranded. And what does that mean? If it's not utilized, it basically goes into the ground, because we don't have an economic way yet to store the electricity. And electricity can't travel very far. It can only go about 200 miles. So if it's not used...
Why is that? Explain that.
It's because of the lack of transmission infrastructure, right? So a perfect example, we have a site in upstate New York that was actually the home of the last standing coal-fired coal plant in the state. And that was retired back in 2020. And what made that site not great from a power plant perspective was that it was located upstate New York, right on the shores of Lake Ontario, where there's abundant renewable resources. Niagara Falls is 20 miles away. But getting that power downstate to New York City or Long Island, where the load pockets are, was virtually impossible, because there's transmission, congestion, charges. It made it uneconomic. So
and there's a loss of some of the energy as it goes down.
There's a loss over time.
Yep.
And so what we need to do now is instead of citing supply where the demand is, you sort of have to flip it and put load where the supply is and where the renewable resources are and where they're abundant and where they're stranded. And it sort of is a perfect match with a Bitcoin miner, because 70% of the cost to mine one Bitcoin is the energy, right? And as Troy mentioned, we're driven to find the lowest cost source of power. And Bitcoin doesn't care where it is. It doesn't care what time of day it is. And it's also the most, I mean, I haven't found a more perfect version of a flexible load that exists, right? You can turn it off and on in the matter of minutes. And so when we work with our grid operators, their mind is, you know, because they're struggling, they're scared. They're like, we've got all of these intermittent resources. The sun shines during the day, the wind blows at night. How am I going to balance this? We've got more and more extreme weather situations coming. And you start to talk to them about the way that Bitcoin mining can be used to help balance that load. And they're sort of like, okay, wow, this is incredible. It's not, you know, 5 or 15 minutes I need to give you a signal. I can give it to you in 3 minutes, and then you can be down in 1 minute. and how many megawatts? And it's sort of like this wide eye opening. And so now you have a place where there's a user of that energy that's paying for it. So that money's going back into investing in the infrastructure. It's creating jobs in a region where thermal resources had been industry for decades. And we had people that were working at the coal plant that were 3-generational, sons, fathers, grandfathers. The coal plant was shut down. That industry was shut down in that region. So now to bring this high technology sort of future for generations to come is kind of a win-win for everybody. So to answer your question on how it works, when you mine a Bitcoin, 70% of it is energy. And so you're trying to, and then you layer onto that, public company costs and things of that nature. But the biggest factor is the marginal cost, which is what you're saying.
Let me just to underline a point that you and Troy both made, which is that you mentioned that wind and solar are intermittent. The sun shines sometimes it doesn't. The wind blows sometimes it doesn't. It's of course, it's a problem when the wind doesn't blow and when the sun doesn't shine. But it's also a problem when the sun does shine and when the wind does blow, because when you generate more electricity than the grid can store or handle, that energy basically gets wasted as well. And the inefficiency of that up and down volatility of how the energy gets generated is something that creates an underlying cost. The cost of operating wind and solar energy is higher than for other sources of energy because of that volatility. And Bitcoin mining can help monetize the excess energy that the solar and wind plants are generating to lower the ultimate cost of delivering solar and wind energy. Would you say that's a fair summary?
No, that's definitely fair. I almost think about the grid like a paper clip, right? The more you play with the paper clip and you bend it, eventually it's going to snap. And so the grid is designed to be stable. There's 8,760 hours in a year, and really only 200 of those hours are where we're at peak demand. And so, another misconception of Bitcoin mining is that you plug in a miner and it's running all of the time. Well, that's really not the case. I mean, my expectation is that the capacity factor for most of these Bitcoin mining facilities is closer to 70%. And why is that the case? Because there's going to be times when it doesn't make sense or is uneconomic to mine Bitcoin, either during extreme weather or during those 200 hours where mining where there's excess demand and it just doesn't make sense. And that's where we can, again, serve as a valuable tool to the grid to turn that down. And what that does for everybody and for the system at whole is balance everything out. So you're less victim to the extreme swings and the unpredictability of wind and solar. You can leverage the significant resources in hydro and in nuclear, which, by the way, have tremendous fixed costs. And if you don't have an anchor tenant, so to speak, to facilitate and absorb those costs, you may not have them in years to come. So that is an enabling way that Bitcoin sort of serves the grid as a whole.
Margot and Chris, this all sounds wonderful and very economically elegant, but I was told that consuming energy is bad for the earth.
Who told you that?
Well, yeah, Chris Larson, among other people. But pipe in here. So, I mean, is energy consumption bad? I mean, there is still, even if Bitcoin is, again, just to play devil's advocate here, okay, yes, this is interesting. Bitcoin can be used to subsidize and reduce the cost of renewable energy. That's wonderful. But we're still consuming more energy, and I was told that if we want to save the earth, we have to reduce the amount of energy we consume, we do not increase it, and Bitcoin consumes energy. It consumes more energy than all of Argentina. So, or at least that's the latest thing I heard from somebody. So, one of my devil's advocate friends. So, is that
I heard
bad?
it was Greece now.
Is it Greece? So, why is it important to consume energy at all? I was told that Ethereum under proof of stake doesn't have to consume any energy.
Chris, do you want it? Oh, you want me? Okay, well, I mean, there have been some correlations of energy use and development of countries and well-being. So I think a certain amount of energy use is certainly good. I think that there's actually a misconception around energy consumption that is tied towards our climate change goals. And it's this idea that in order to reduce emissions, we have to reduce our energy use. And that's not necessarily accurate because there are multiple ways that we can reduce emissions, but also the distribution of energy globally is heterogeneous. So Not everyone uses as much energy as we do in the West, and particularly in the United States. And in particular, this one fact about Bitcoin's energy use when they compare it against other countries is sort of taken out of context, because it's still, about like 0.5% of the global energy consumption. Or I guess of electricity consumption, and it's even less of global energy. And also there's a lot of wasted energy out there as well. And it's like, 0.08% of wasted energy. So you could run many, many Bitcoin networks on wasted energy alone, which is something that Troy was alluding to, which is that the network itself, because of the requirements around the electricity cost, being such a dominant component of the economics and the competitiveness of the market, we're going to see more Bitcoin miners using this wasted energy, and there's plenty of that out there. So it's not necessarily increasing like the whole net or the whole total global energy use. It can find clever ways to utilize that wasted energy. So, it sounds scary because it is a big number, but in context, it's not that big, and it's comparative to other industries like data centers in general.
Chris, tell us a little about your organization, too, while you're at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, it's great to be here, and also what a day for Bitcoin to be up 6%, right? At heart, I'm an environmentalist. I think I'm the only BPI Fellow that works for an environmental organization. But let me ask you a question first. Put up your hand if you care about Bitcoin or are pro-Bitcoin because of the environment. Okay, so a few hands that went up, more than I thought, honestly. And really, I think I speak for some of my fellow panelists here, that one of the reasons why I care about this issue and have become pro-Bitcoin is because of the environmental angle. And I'd like to flip the narrative on its head a little bit when it comes to energy usage or kind of the typical response from Bitcoin advocates when it comes to this question, like, oh, isn't Bitcoin energy usage bad for the planet? And I think that our go-to response as a community tends to be, oh, no, it's not that bad. We don't actually use that much energy. Compared to other industries, we don't use that much. Actually, the emissions from Bitcoin aren't that high. And I think those are all true things, but we need to flip it on its head and really talk about the proactive role that Bitcoin can actually play in accelerating a clean energy transition. And I'm not an academic, and I'm an environmentalist, but my fellow academics here, or the academics on this panel, who are my fellow panelists, they have talked about the role that Bitcoin can play in fixing interconnection issues, in smoothing out the grid, in allowing more clean energy to come onto the grid. And I think that's such a powerful message that we need to lean into a lot more. When you see people like Elizabeth Warren say, we need to regulate Bitcoin mining because it's leading to climate change, that is, in my opinion, one of the biggest threats to the growth of Bitcoin and its ability to be a part of our modern world. And if we want to prevent this environmental narrative from taking hold and frankly leading to the disinformation that it has, then we need to stop talking about Bitcoin as not that bad, but as actually a solution to some of our clean energy problems.
I'd like to propose something, and any of you feel free to shoot me down. Doesn't matter that I'm the moderator. If I'm an idiot, that's okay. I think we're having completely the wrong conversation about Bitcoin energy consumption, not on this panel, but in general, in the world. And the reason I'm going to propose that is because there is no inherent reason that the energy consumption of Bitcoin miners consumes carbon. We could have an electricity grid that's entirely powered by nuclear fission that would emit zero carbon, and then everyone, whether they're playing video games, watching Netflix, charging their Teslas, mining Bitcoin, none of that would consume carbon. If you charge your Tesla today, you might think you're like a very environmental person, but that electricity could come from coal. It could come from natural gas. It could come from nuclear. It could come from wind and solar. It could come from hydroelectric. It could come from anything, right? So Bitcoin, in a sense, is consuming the energy, but it's not Bitcoin's fault that the energy is coming from a carbon-emitting source. It is the source of the people who built the fault of the people who built the electricity grid. And we don't have to have an electricity grid that's powered by fossil fuels. We can have an electricity grid that's powered by nuclear energy. We have chosen not to. So why have we chosen not to, and why is it that we're saying we shouldn't have Bitcoin when we should be just saying, let's have more nuclear energy? I know at Terawulf, you guys are involved in this space. Tell us about that.
Yeah, listen, when we started the company, being zero carbon was core to our company. We don't think there's any reason why Bitcoin mining cannot be zero carbon and why it cannot be 100% sourced from renewable resources. And there's also, the reality that mining with thermal resources is expensive, right? There's volatility, there's collateral requirements because of that volatility, there's carbon emission taxes, or not taxes, but costs that are associated with it. So it's pretty expensive. And again, as I mentioned before, it's a marginal cost game for a Bitcoin miner to be profitable. So I don't think there's any reason not to be zero carbon, and that's our mission. And I think, part of the bad rap that I think we get, and I think that Bitcoin gets, is because, people are still talking about themes from 10 years ago when, people like Troy were mining in their garages and using, maybe municipal power, and then actually having, if it was enough scale, having an impact on energy prices. That's no longer tied to reality. I mean, at its core, Bitcoin mining is energy infrastructure, and I'm not a Bitcoin native. I come from the energy infrastructure space, and so that's what I've done, is sort of know how to operate and site and procure power at term and at low cost. So, there's really no reason why those two can't be together. I just think that there's some themes that people are tied to, and that's not to say that Bitcoin mining is perfect, by the way. There are things that we as miners need to work on and improve: transparency, disclosure, to name a few. And to standardize that to help with the issues, but I 100% agree with your statement.
I mean, France gets 70% of its electricity from nuclear energy. You could mine Bitcoin in France, and then you're not emitting any carbon with the electricity source.
I would love to add something to this conversation because, absolutely, there was a misstep around nuclear, and unfortunately now we're in a particularly dire situation in regard to wanting to do this energy transition. And the Biden administration came in with a goal of decarbonizing all energy in the U.S. around 50% below 2005 levels. And that is a goal in order to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, to keep our global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we have to work with the technology that we have in terms of electricity production, and hopefully nuclear will eventually become a bigger role, but right now that's going to be solar and wind and battery storage. And I also think that it's really important for us to also acknowledge that, yes, the electrical grid is not necessarily within our control or the miners' control, but at the same time, we all play a role as miners, they are loads on the grid, and there is a shared responsibility between the loads and the producers on those emissions. So we have to accept that we do have a responsibility to reduce emissions overall. So I think it's really important to emphasize the ways in which the Bitcoin industry can do that. And in particular, we're looking at how the miners are participating in the electrical grid when they do demand response. And there was a study published in 2014 that showed that the way miners participate in demand response by being able to turn on and off very quickly to avoid that peak demand actually cuts into the revenue of the natural gas peaker plants, which helps reduce the emissions of the electrical grid. So if you're interested in reducing grid emissions, that's something you would want on your electrical grid. Outside of the grid, you can co-locate Bitcoin miners with like wind or solar generators, and we are seeing that already. And what that does is it creates a revenue floor for those operations, because again, like the mining industry, it's very competitive. It's a very almost perfect a market, and so they're driving down the cost of their electricity that they produce. So you need a revenue floor to maintain those producers, those energy producers. So Bitcoin miners can provide that. You can you can give an X percent to a Bitcoin mining operation to ensure that you always have some revenue, so you're not relying on the grid, because the grid operator could tell you that we have too much electricity on the grid, you can't sell it, and so that's a loss.
Just to summarize that, so, and tell me if I'm mis-summarizing your point. When Bitcoin miners turn down their usage or shut off their miners when there's peak energy demand, say in Texas, you've got some hot July summer, you've got the big winter storm, and you have massive electricity demand, the Bitcoin miners turn off their miners. They're not merely doing it because they're nice. There's actually an economic incentive that's built into the system that enables them to do that in a way that makes everyone better off. It's a win-win trade.
Absolutely, and that's probably one of the most powerful features of Bitcoin, is this built-in economic incentive that doesn't require you to force anybody to do the right thing. And I think that's a really, really powerful thing that is not totally understood or appreciated in all of the discussions that are going on in the media and in Congress.
Yeah, I got to take this question. I do believe in Scope 2 emissions. So I maybe
What are Scope 2 emissions?
we have, if you're actually like burning fossil fuels in your backyard, that's Scope 1 as part of your operations. If you're purchasing electricity that was generated by burning fossil fuels, that's your Scope 2 effect. So I do believe in the causation indirectly of emissions, but I also think that when we're thinking about regulation of our energy system, we don't start with Scope 2, we start with Scope 1, or we start with the generation of electricity. So
In other words, let's have a more low-carbon electricity grid,
Absolutely.
as opposed to blaming the people who are consuming electricity.
Absolutely, that's the right place to start. It seems to me bizarre, and I have to say that philosophically, when we have this discussion, it seems bizarre that we would target one particular use of energy, one industry, and say, that's a non-worthy use of energy. Others
Video
are worthy.
games is a very worthy use of energy, I just want to say.
But I mean, that just philosophically, we have markets decide what is a worthy use of energy, and then we regulate externalities at the level of production. Philosophically, like, that's where we have to have this discussion. I mean, that's more important than anything that's been said on the panel, I think, so far. Like, philosophically, that's where it's at. At a level up, your question about is using energy bad? This is what's interesting. Electricity is unintuitive as a good. It's not like some kind of stable good. It's like food that rots instantly. You either use it or lose it. In our system, we have to create an abundance of energy all the time in case people use more. And so we are constantly wasting tons and tons of energy. We're wasting it in transmission. We're wasting it in the sense that we, for instance, just don't, we have more capacity at solar plants and wind plants than we actually have inverters for and capacity to send to the grid. There's wasted energy all throughout the system. There's 4.7 times as much methane gas just burned in oil fields, just burned, than the entire Bitcoin network uses. So waste energy is rampant throughout the system, and it's only going to get worse because intermittent renewables bake in waste, and we are planning on tripling electricity generation, at least tripling, maybe quadrupling or quintupling. Electricity generation in this country over the next couple of decades, I mean, extraordinary moonshot kind of endeavor we're engaged in with renewable sources that build in tons of waste. And when you see this, that's why you see the IEA's recommendation that we multiply flexible loads by tenfold by 2030 and 20-fold by 2050. Those recommendations make sense because we are radically transforming our energy system in a way that generates more waste. Batteries will meet part of that. We'll meet part of that through enhanced interconnection. But a lot of it has got to come from users that are flexible. And Bitcoin is a perfectly flexible load to do that. In a way, when thinking about energy use and whether it's wasteful or harmful for the environment, I think that we start with something like a waste not, want not mentality. Electricity, energy is a precious good. It's like other precious goods. We don't want to waste it, or we won't have as much left over for other people. It's a very, I guess, human scale way of thinking. We don't think in terms of electricity. With electricity, it's highly distributed in time and space. In some places it is scarce, and that's where you have crises on the grid. In other places it is abundant and wasted, places and times. The principle that we need to update our minds to in order to align with the needs of the grid and the energy system is, don't waste electricity when and where it is scarce. When and where it is scarce, it is also expensive. And Bitcoin already does not use expensive energy, and it is trending to use only the cheapest energy. We want that energy used. Why? Because that provides more revenue for the sellers of energy, and we need them to have that revenue in order for their business case to pencil out, in order for us to make the transition faster. Those are the pieces that basically fell into place for me, and why I'm advocating for this now rather than fighting it.
Can I just add a little bit of statistical color to that as well? Just purely looking at Bitcoin's energy usage, I looked up the latest statistic this morning. The estimate is that about 58% of the energy that Bitcoin mining uses is zero emissions. If you compare that to the US economy is about 40% zero emissions last year. And so really, Bitcoin mining is already almost 50% cleaner than the US economy in terms of the energy it uses. So that, I think, already puts it a little bit into juxtaposition in our minds. But then also, in terms of kind of the proactive way of looking at it, we, when talking about how Bitcoin can actually play a role in this clean energy transition, we've seen a lot about how right now we're struggling to get more renewables onto the grid because of interconnection issues. Last year, at the end of last year, we had 8,100 wind, solar, and battery storage projects that were waiting to come onto the grid. So that is a lot of clean energy that we currently cannot use, and to your point, is literally being wasted because the wind is blowing, the sun is shining, we're not using it. And so the question is, what are the tools that we can use to get that clean energy onto the grid? And I'm not saying Bitcoin mining is like the one bullet solution there, but it is one of the tools that we can use to balance some of that load. It can be flexible, and it can allow for a greater incentive for those areas that currently are not able to bring that energy onto the grid to do that, because they know that there will always be a user of that energy of last resort, and that can be Bitcoin mining. And so really just flipping that narrative on its head is that Bitcoin already is honestly pretty clean when it comes to its mining, but it can also really help us in our clean energy goals by balancing the grid and bring those projects online. And I think that's really a beautiful narrative that we as a community don't talk about nearly enough.
Okay, I was channeling Chris Larson earlier, and Chris, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I'm going to switch now to Elizabeth Warren, okay? Let me try to channel Elizabeth Warren here. All right, so we've established three things. We've established, one, that Bitcoin consumes energy. I think we can all agree on that. We've established that Bitcoin can subsidize and reduce the cost of delivering renewable energy because of some of these inefficiencies and volatility in the way renewable energy is generated. And we've established that Bitcoin consumes energy, Bitcoin mining consumes energy, but it's really about who generates the energy and how you generate the energy in the beginning that really matters. Is it done through nuclear? Is it done through coal? Is it done through natural gas, et cetera, wind and solar? Okay, all that's fine. But when I play video games or I use air conditioning or run a data center for Amazon, these are useful things. These are socially useful things. Bitcoin is magic internet money. It's not useful compared to air conditioning or Amazon sending me, a USB drive. So explain to me why magic internet money is a legitimate and socially worthwhile consumer of energy.
Isn't that the rest of this day? Aren't we going to? I was hoping.
I think that's the next talk.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think about streaming internet porn as the base case. Like, defend the use of that. It's using energy. It uses a lot of energy. I think that having permissionless hard money with a fixed supply that protects anyone against debasement of their currency worldwide, allows anyone access to a payment system. I mean, fundamentally, this is transforming human existence, the ability to send value from peer to peer, from anyone to anyone else, in the way that the internet allowed us to send information from anyone to anyone. It's a fundamental transformational technology. So of course I think it's valuable. If you don't buy into it. I guess this is, I almost don't want to answer the question. Markets decide what's valuable. what's a socially valuable use. I do not want a central planning committee to say what is and isn't valuable. Of course I have my opinions, I've just stated, but I mean, what bothers me is the presumption behind the question that someone is in a position to make that judgment other than us collectively doing so with what we choose to trade for.
I guess I have just a kind of very simplistic and energy-minded way of thinking about it, right? Because we've all talked about on this panel today the abundant amount of stranded renewable resources that we have today. The grid was designed to meet a peak load. That peak load is only achieved a fraction of the year, and the rest of the time, because they're renewable by nature, they don't stop what they're doing. So Bitcoin basically takes what is a local commodity that cannot be stored, that cannot travel very far, and it converts it into a global commodity that can store value, and by the way, can be traded and can be accessible to everybody. And so that's, to me, in the purest sense, the value that Bitcoin has to us as you know, a community and humanity.
Yeah, I think just to quickly add, everyone in this room obviously has some kind of reason why they're in favor of Bitcoin, and I think most of us will agree, like from a national security perspective, from an economic equality perspective, from a human rights perspective, those are all good things about Bitcoin. But to Troy's point, I think we can put aside even that when it comes to the environmental conversation, take off our Bitcoin hat, put on our environmental hat, and look at it as a tool when it comes to this, right? If right now we can't be getting this clean energy online to be used and is literally being wasted, then surely any tool that allows it to come online is good regardless of its other benefits. And so even if we don't care about Bitcoin from its economic or national security perspectives, we can care about it from an environmental perspective because it smooths out the grid, it creates an incentive for more clean energy to come online. And so from a purely environmental perspective, it can just be a tool. And I think that's a really powerful narrative.
Kerri, Margot, Troy, Chris, thank you so much for talking to us through this today. Thank you all.